Welcome all, and thank you for taking the time to join us at Smurfit Executive Development for our webinar today. We'll just wait about 30 seconds or so there just to make sure that everybody gets a chance to log in and join us today. And I suppose before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to share some recent news with you about Smurfit Executive Development. We're delighted to announce that we are the leading Irish provider of executive education and have been ranked in the global top 50 and EU top 50 in both open enrollment and custom executive education in the 2024 Financial Times Executive Education Rankings. The highlights include global top 50 ranking, EU top 25 in both open enrollment and custom executive education, ranked 33rd globally in custom executive education, and ranked 46th globally in open enrollment in the global top 50 for the 7th year in a row. As a team and a university, we're very proud of these rankings as they are customer driven and underpin our dedication of the pursuit of excellence in our field from the Financial Times. My name is James Bannigan. I'm a member of the client relationship team here at Smurfit. Joining us today from our world-renowned faculty are two global experts in the field of sustainable supply chain management, full Professor Mark Pagel and Assistant Professor Helece van Staten. Sustainability, digitization, and resilience are interconnected themes essentially for designing next practice supply chains. Smurfit Executive Development's new diploma in supply chain management is a part-time flexible program tailored for leaders working in the field. Mark and Helece will discuss in the session sustainable supply chain management, opportunities, risks, and resilience, and this will offer you a flavour of what you can expect from the program. The question and answer portal is open, so if you wish to ask questions throughout, we'll address them as we go and hold some back for at the end as well. So I'd like to hand you over to Mark and Helece.
All right, thanks, James. Welcome, everybody. So to build on what James was saying, this is a conversation. We'll talk to each other, but we want you to participate as well. So please do ask questions if you have them via the question portal. So I guess I'm going to start by talking for a couple minutes about the importance, from our perspective at least, of having a program not in supply chain management or sustainability, but doing both together. When we think about supply chain management, we usually talk about it as, effectively, it's the part of the organization that delivers value to customers, right? This is how your good or service is created. This is what determines whether or not your customers get the value that they paid for, and whether or not they come back. And when you look at almost any organization's supply chain, it's comprised of a large number of organizations, both suppliers, customers, entities who provide finance, and all those other things. And almost any supply chain, when you think of the focal company, the organization with the brand on it, whether it's Nestle or it's Smurfit or it's the Smurfit Business School, right? We think of the brand, but the reality is that the supply chain is where almost all of the value creation activities are taking place. So the typical manufacturer, for instance, would spend about 70% of their cost of goods sold upstream with suppliers. In other words, if they manage their suppliers poorly, they're not going to deliver what they need to their customers. What's important, and the reason that we talk about sustainability simultaneously, is that when you think about the sustainable component of an organization, the organization's impact on the environment, its impact on society, and you map where its impacts are, those maps look almost identical to the maps for where the value creation occurs. In other words, there are very few organizations who say their carbon footprint, one way you could think of where their impact on the environment comes from. Most organizations' carbon footprint is almost entirely due to the activities of others. right? In other words, most companies, when they talk about sustainability today and when they talk about addressing climate change, they're only talking about their own activities. And even if their own activities are optimized and they are actually carbon neutral, the reality is the supply chain still isn't. And the supply chain is where almost all of the impacts occur. What this means then is that if you want to manage the supply chain well and you want to deal with sustainability, you have to do both at once. We're not, the supply chain group at UCD isn't great at tooting our own horn, but I would suggest that we've known this for a very long time. But the reality is, and I think that's why this program is really important now, is that getting that message across to others has been difficult because the typical conversations about sustainability and the environment and so on have treated this as a risk, a threat, a cost, and haven't really talked about, well, if you have to do this, how do you do it well? And one of the things that's certainly changed in the last, I'd say, 5 years is that 5 years ago, we had to sell students on taking this program. Today, students demand. I'm talking about MSc students, but I assume if you're here today, you're also demanding it, right? And one of the ways that we can really see that is that one of the things that we do in our MSc program, and I should be clear, all the faculty who will teach in this diploma also teach in our globally ranked MSc in Sustainable Supply Chain Management. One of the things we do in that MSc program is that we do company projects each summer. And those projects have changed dramatically over the last few years.
Yeah, so thank you, Mark. And also it's great to be here. So if we talk about our projects, I'll jump in there. So as Mark mentioned, the last few years, we've seen a real shift in the projects. Now, perhaps I should mention that these are consulting projects that our students do in the summer term with companies in Dublin, and the companies provide the topics to our students. And the shift in these topics we've really seen the majority this year is sustainability focused, particularly environmentally focused, whereas the remainder would be digital or automation. And a big drive when we say environmentally focused is companies are starting to, what Mark mentioned about value chain and where our environmental impact is they want to start mapping out where is our emissions, or even just start figuring out what is our supply chain emissions. Now, unfortunately, to do that, while the calculations itself is straightforward, we need reliable, clear data for that. And for instance, if you're a company that's outsourcing your transportation for your products, you don't know what fuel is being burned, you don't know shipment miles, you don't know transportation mode, very likely, or where transshipments took place. And we need all of these to actually start estimating our emissions, to identify where's our hotspots in the supply chain, what is our different scopes of emissions. So we're seeing a large demand from companies trying to figure out, okay, where are we? What is our emissions? And a big driver that we believe for the shift is also upcoming regulations, especially in the EU, such as the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the CSRD, the CBAM, or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Both of these specific companies have to start reporting their environmental and social impact from 2025. With CBAM, specific industries will be liable to pay for embedded carbon in their products. And all of this means you have to know who's your suppliers and who's the suppliers of your suppliers to do this as comprehensively as possible. So in a way, these regulations can also be seen as a risk to our supply chain, especially if we're not prepared for these upcoming changes or requirements. So maybe, Mark, I can then come back to you and ask if you want to share on more risks that's relevant to our supply chains.
Yeah, and actually, I had one regulation you didn't talk about, and the acronyms I'm not good with, so maybe we're thinking the same thing, but I didn't hear the right, was the supply chain due diligence.
Yeah.
Right, because what's critical about that one, as I understand it, is that you don't just need to know and report, but you're responsible for it. Right. And you see, and in fact, somebody had sent me an article today about one of the pharmacy chains in the US having serious problems with their generic drugs and really large number of recalls. And their response was, well, we outsource that. It's the supplier's fault. Customers have never bought that, right? In other words, when your supply chain screws up, customers always blame you. They always have. But legally, you could blame the supplier. In the EU, you're not going to be able to blame the supplier going forward. And that means that if there are problems in the supply chain, whether it's faulty drugs or faulty products, whether it's the use of child labor, using people who are not in the country legally, any of those things that can be going on in your supply chain, you're now responsible for. That's a huge shift, right? That's very different from customers will punish us if this comes to light, from we are now legally responsible for it, right? So we have all of these things going on legally in the background, but there are also a lot of other changes going on that are also potentially viewed as, big risks if you don't manage them well. If you talk to people, especially people who have operations in coastal areas, or if you have a house in a coastal area, right? You may not be able to get insurance right now, or getting insurance might be really expensive because insurance companies don't really care what's causing climate change. They know it's happening and they're seeing ever bigger losses in coastal communities, and they're unwilling to take those risks on. If you can't get insurance for your operations, that's not just something that's annoying, right? That probably indicates there's a really good chance that those operations could be disrupted, right? Insurance companies are pretty good bettors, right? If they're unwilling to insure that risk, it's probably pretty high. Similarly, you're seeing banks starting to, you can even see this in the Irish mortgage market, right? That if your house has a better BER rating, you get a lower interest rate. And that's happening in the commercial sector as well. And there are certain industries, coal's a really good example. We're getting financing for a coal project these days is difficult. And getting long-term financing for a coal project is almost impossible because while some banks will loan money to you on the assumption, well, you're going to get away with burning coal for the next decade, they're not going to loan it to you for 30 years because they're pretty certain in 30 years that industry is no longer going to exist, right? So you've got issues with finance and regulation. And you think about coal's probably one of the first industries that's going to full stop lose its license to operate, but there are going to be other examples of that, right? And those are obviously huge risks in the supply chain. We go back to the insurers, right? The things they won't insure you for, in essence, huge potential disruptions in your supply chain. And I'm guessing a lot of you are here today because for the last 5 years, your supply chain has been disrupted on a regular basis and it hasn't been any fun. And it's kind of interesting to look at this over time because for most of, from let's say 1990 to 2020, we'd gotten really used to supply chains functioning well. Right, that we had gone through a period where we started to expect things were of perfect quality, they got delivered on time, they got delivered the next day, and it mostly worked until a couple years ago, and now it frequently doesn't work. Well, those same things that insurers won't cover are going to increase the likelihood of those disruptions, right? Again, if you've got operations, they're in coastal areas or in places that flood on a regular basis, they're going to be disrupted, right? You think about some of the excessive heat events we've had recently where roads have melted, train tracks have warped to the point that the trains can't run, that's all going to mean deliveries that don't get made. Or, you can look at some of the things that are happening with water transport in the last year. That, what's happened in the Red Sea is on the news a lot around here. What you may not be aware of is that the Panama Canal has actually had to reduce the number of containers that can be on a ship going through the canal because they've had such long-term drought that the boats can't get through. I'm sorry, ships, right? I'm not
Vessels.
That's our logistics expert. I apologize. But the reality is that the water level has basically dropped and it may never come back. That's not, when we used to talk about supply chain disruptions, we would talk about, okay, we're not gonna be able to do this for a week. I need some safety stock, right? Or I need to make customers happy. You're talking about the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal being out of business for years at a time. That's dramatically different, right? And you can think about all of these things are interrelated, right? These are not just random events. They are random events that are caused by non-random events. And that non-random event is what we've done to the climate. Other things to think about that are really important. Customers in some industries are starting to demand, or at least customers are starting to punish you when you screw up, right? To go back to that due diligence component, right? Customers expect your supply chain to follow regulation. Customers do not assume that you're using child labor. Customers assume that you are a minimum following environmental regulations, and they prefer that you did more than that, right? And they're certainly going to punish you when you don't meet those expectations. And again, when your suppliers don't meet those expectations. But they may not pay for it, which means that you have to find ways to do these things that are still efficient, that still meet your very real needs to be profitable. And then, of course, there's also the fact that in a lot of industries, you have competitors who are moving quicker. And if they're moving faster and they're saying, all right, this is the way the world's moving, we're going to get there first, right? And you can see this in like the valuation of the electric car companies, especially BYD and Tesla. Their valuations relative to their volume, especially in Tesla's case, where their volume is minuscule, their supply chain's kind of crap. And you're asking, well, why are they worth more than all the legacy car makers combined? And the answer is very simple. They're prepared for what most people believe is going to be the next generation of personal transport, while most of the entities they're competing with are still trying to deliver the last version of that. Now, this is all potentially really depressing, right? But one of the kind of key tenets of economics and management is, of course, all of these risks are also opportunities. And you see that when we start talking about competitors, right? So there are obviously lots of opportunities in this space as well, if it's managed well.
Yeah, so but maybe I'd like to add to a couple of things that you mentioned, Mark, because you talked about supply chains functioning well, and especially legacy supply chains. And this morning I read, for instance, that Toyota is essentially betting on, let's say, at least hybrid electric vehicles for the foreseeable future. So they've released new technology for internal combustion engines. And the question then becomes, because they in essence, they're probably betting on keeping their supply chain, which they're famous for as having one of the best, most efficient supply chains in the world. We have just in time that evolved from that. And the question is, will this supply chain at the end become a liability for Toyota? Or would, yeah.
Yeah, and amusingly, I read the same article. And you link that back to the Tesla thing, right? So ignore all the hype around Tesla and think about what they're currently managing in a supply chain. They have one supply chain. It's an electric vehicle supply chain. They built it from scratch to be profitable at their current volume. And they built it with suppliers who are ready for that electric future. Toyota has a supply chain that needs to sell, I would guess, 10 times as many vehicles as Tesla to be profitable. It was built with suppliers who are very, very good at making combustion engines, but some of whom have no experience in the electric space. And so in essence, Toyota's bet on doing more of the same, and that's great. But if the world does move, Toyota's going to get to the point where either they're going to have to do what most of the other car companies are already doing, build a second supply chain alongside what they have, right? So if you look at, say, Volkswagen, they have their traditional combustion engine supply chain, and they've built a brand new, and I believe they've spent 180 billion euros on it so far, electric vehicle supply chain that basically is paralleling it, and they're putting one out of business while managing the other one to get bigger. Toyota's either going to have to do that, and if they do that, that means that their suppliers are going to get dumped and get pissed off, or they're going to have to go out of business. We're talking about this from Toyota's perspective, but of course their suppliers aren't morons. If you're a supplier to Toyota and you see them betting on combustion engines, what might you do in the interim? Sorry, I forgot. I'm not teaching. There's no one to answer my questions today. Right? In the interim, if you're a supplier who thinks that's not the future, you might actually leave Toyota high and dry, right? Or at least you might continue supplying Toyota and try and do kind of like what Volkswagen's doing, right? I'll keep supplying Toyota these combustion engine parts because they'll keep buying. But I'm going to use that money to invest in supplying Tesla. Right. And so these are all really important supply chain questions, but they're also really opportunities, right? If you can get ahead of these curves, but you have to ask these questions. Yeah. Otherwise, they are just risks that manifest when you don't want them to.
And you probably particularly want to do that because we know EVs require fewer suppliers. So you want to adapt to be able to stay ahead, to stay operating in the future. But then if we shift to opportunities, so one of the things that we are seeing emerging and are the opportunity for new business models. So for instance, again, in the EU, we have the EU Green Deal, which basically that's our pathway towards net zero by 2050. Whether we'll get there, that's debatable. There's still lots that we can do, but we know, okay, the EU Green Deal, it's basically based around circularity. So how can we keep products in use for longer? How can we limit our reliance on finite resources as inputs? And especially if we think of closed loop supply chains, the opportunity there then becomes, can we remanufacture our products? Can we start leasing our products instead of selling our products? Can we extend the lifetime? But that also brings with it strategic questions, such as, do I need to reconfigure my network? So again, is my supply chain, is it solid for my pathway going forward? How am I going to remanufacture? If I remanufacture, what's the effects going to be on supply chain coordination? Between what kind of contracts do I need? So if you want to jump in, Mark, I see you kind of.
No, I was just checking how long we've been babbling for.
Are we good?
We are good. Yes, we can keep babbling.
Right.
But of course, if you have questions, also you can ask them. And I think it's really important because usually at around this point, a hand goes up, and the question is almost always about the cost. In other words, and this is something that I think business schools have made worse, and certainly politicians have made worse. We always talk about this change as a cost, right? Which I find fascinating, because typically in the business school, when we talk about creative destruction, we talk about it as a good thing, right? New companies come up with new technologies, new ways of delivering value. They enter a market, they disrupt the market, and the incumbents in the market have to adapt or die. And that is capitalism 101, and we're all for it in a place like the UCD Smurfit School, right? But when we talk about sustainability, the same thing is occurring, right? But the driver may start with regulation, it may start with consumer demand, it may start with people wanting a different type of lifestyle, but the end result is still the same, right? That you have new entrants into a market who are competing in new ways, delivering value in new ways, and the existing companies have to adapt or die. But we talked about that adaptation or dying as a cost. And that's the question that, right? So somebody always brings up that cost at about this point in these conversations. And I think it's really important to remember, yes, if your current supply chain cannot deliver sustainably, you're going to have to spend money to address that problem. But that money is not like going into a black hole, right? That money's going to somebody. So, you think about like the cost, we talk a lot about the cost of the energy transition. Well, you've probably also noticed that there are now a huge number of relatively new companies who are capitalizing on that energy transition, right? They're the people who are installing solar panels and heat pumps. They're the ones who are doing external installation, installing external insulation, right? All of those things, those are, when we talk about the cost of the transition, that's not a cost to them. That's how they make money, right? And all of those costs, the same thing, right? When we talk about Volkswagen having those two parallel supply chains, that sucks for Volkswagen. But that's good for their new suppliers, right? These are all potential opportunities. And we tend to get stuck on the downsides of sustainability, right? Oh, I can't get insurance. My supply chain is going to be disrupted. I'm going to have to spend lots of money. And we tend not to think about it as, well, you know what? If the world's changing, and the world's always changing, and when we talk about business, managers are always talking about how, high levels of uncertainty, and uncertainty has increased, and we have all these disruptions. Building a supply chain that's actually suited to that, sure, it's a cost, but it's also an opportunity, especially if you're competing with others who don't, right? And their supply chain is still trying to compete like it's 2019, because they're probably going to start giving you money as they slowly go out of business, right? So I think it's really important that we remember that, like anything else in business, what's a cost or a risk for one entity is an opportunity or potential profit space for another, right? And these opportunities are there if your supply chain is well managed, right? And you can see we've got our notes here, and amusingly, what it says in our notes here is that, again, we would argue that this has been a core component of what we do at Smurfit in our MSc programs for a fairly long time. And so if you're on this call, what our notes say is that you should have done the diploma, or you should have gotten an MSc with us a decade ago. But this is your second best opportunity, right? That the bad news is you have to do this stuff. And if you do it poorly, or if you've waited too long, it's going to be expensive. And it could put the entire organization and the supply chain at risk. The good news is, in most industries, this is still also an opportunity. And if you do it well, it's also a chance to actually be prepared for the next 20 or 30 years as a leader. The title of this talk was supposed to be Risks, Opportunities, and Resilience. And until just now, I don't think either of us said the word resilience. Is that right?
No, but we definitely, I would say, implied it. So we've had several conversations around this about what is resilience. And simply put, we know if it's just our ability to recover from disruptions. And that's what you've been talking about and we've been sharing.
Yeah, and actually, one of the interesting things, right? Academia is often viewed as kind of slow and behind the times. But one of the big things debated among supply chain thinkers these days is what does resilience mean, right? Because we typically do talk about it as the ability to recover, with the implied that you're recovering so you can go back to doing what you did before.
That's usual.
Yeah. And interestingly, and this is again where, when you see that cross fertilization, when you mix supply chain management with sustainability, environmental economists and ecologists, when they talk about resilience, they talk about it from a biological standpoint. And species don't necessarily go back to the previous state when their environment is disrupted, but they adapt. And so one of the things that's kind of built in, and it's also been implied in everything we've been talking about for right on half an hour.
Okay.
So we're managing time well, which isn't always the case, is that resilience, a resilient supply chain is both able to get back to where it was quickly if that's the right answer, but it's also adaptable to a changing world, right? And, you go back to that Toyota example where they built a supply chain that is awesome, but arguably isn't very adaptable, right? So it's very good at returning to its current state.
Yeah.
And it's very good at what they currently do, but it's not designed to be adaptable. And that is, and that in essence is the thing that they have to face up to, right? So we haven't said resilience, but it is assumed. And we can think about that resilience in a couple ways.
Before we go into that, like when you were talking about adapting, I perhaps also wanted to mention that the benefit of having our faculty teaching on this diploma is we can all also adapt to what we're offering based on the requirements or the skills level of the participants, based on the industries and based on, for instance, what we've been sharing here. So back to resilience, which perhaps is a part of that. So being more practical, usually in teaching, I like listening to you because you always talk also perhaps more strategic lens. So if we think of maybe more tactical or even operational lens.
I prefer that to more practical. Yes, that's fine.
Which is brilliant. We cater to all audiences. But for instance, then from an operational or tactical side, if you think of resilience, preparing, especially from the definition you've given from the biological standpoint, is how can we prepare our future supply chains? Be that, are we going to consider, again, coming back to what's our network design currently looking like? Do we need to consider opportunities to nearshore, bringing our manufacturing closer? But then what does it mean? Like, where are our customers based? And what effect does that have, again, on our workers and our supply chain? Because we know as well, that's one of the effects also why Toyota is perhaps so rigid, because of the fixed jobs that they have in the supply chain. So can we add buffer inventory or redundancy for our supply chain? But I know also strategically there's more opportunities for us.
And again, I prefer strategically to impractical. Right? You think of it at the most strategic level, this is about survival, being adaptable, having a supply chain that can change with changing conditions, having a supply chain that is able to be disrupted and still deliver value without that being a financial crisis quickly, right? That increases your likelihood of being able to survive. So I think that's really important. We haven't talked much about people, right? We should have, because when we talk about sustainability, the environmental component is often what's in the news, but sustainability is as much about how your operations affect the communities you operate in and society, and implicitly then your workers and so on. And there's been a lot of, when you look at our globalized model supply chains today, a lot of that globalization was done to move production to places where wages were lower. Regulation was, it might have been as strict on the books as it is here, but it wasn't enforced, or maybe it just didn't exist. And there was kind of an implicit that we were moving to pay people less, and they probably were lower skilled, not necessarily because they couldn't do the work that was done here, but just because they hadn't been trained to do it. That again, right? If you're betting on people who are not being trained well, who are not being paid well, to help you survive through a turbulent period, both turbulent in terms of what's happening in the business environment with all the different disruptions we're having, the political environment, which is also disrupting business, and then the whole little climate thing going on in the background, right? You want people who are adaptable as well, right? And so that those skills become really important. And we haven't talked enough about that. But part of building a supply chain that is resilient, that is future ready, is going to be having people who are able to adapt and respond. And when the Suez Canal closes, they can deal with it, right? Both in the short term, okay, we've got vessels on the water that need to get somewhere now, and maybe they've got perishable things on them and so on, and we need to deal with that. See, practical. Or longer term, okay, well, we've built a supply chain that kind of assumed this shipping route existed and it no longer does. What do we do? Right? And our suppliers are going to be able to help us with that problem, or are they going to hinder us with that problem? And if they're a hindrance, they probably shouldn't remain our suppliers going forward, right? Because this is bound to happen again. So we can think about resilience from a survival standpoint and adaptability standpoint. We can think about resilience from the standpoint of if you redesign your supply chain so it's less dependent on non-renewable resources. Non-renewable resources will eventually run out. That's bad for long-term survival. But non-renewable resources also get disrupted before they run out, right? And so the less you require those non-renewable resources, the more you're able to capture resources that are used in your delivery of your product or service and get them back through some kind of circular model, the more you're buffered from the market and the disruptions in the market, right? Because you control that resource and you can use it over and over again, right?
And especially if these are critical elements or minerals, such as, for instance, again, what we need for battery manufacturing for EVs.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good example, right? That access to things like lithium, there are what, 2-3 suppliers globally, and they're all located in parts of the world that our governments wouldn't necessarily want you doing business with. You would prefer to.
Sorry, Mark, and that's really interesting because a question has just come in actually in relation to that, and it's as you're talking there, it's actually asking about so can you take the learnings practically from the program and then practically apply these back at your business or back at the ranch, and then the other part is another question separately is, can this apply then to a range of industries and a range of organizations?
I mean, the short answer to both questions is yes. And right, we would hope that and maybe that's not coming across in a setting like this, but we would hope that what we're talking about is very practically minded. Whether it's rethinking,
your own operations or supply chain,
who your partners are, how you pick those partners, things like that. And industry-wide, I mean, we probably are more used to dealing with certain industries in Ireland. That's a given just because of who's around us,
Okay.
But the reality is, and I think, probably one of our real strengths at Smurfit, especially in the supply chain space relative to other local schools, is the depth of our faculty in terms of where they've worked, kind of work they've had. Even my impractical self, I used to be a project manager in a construction company. I've actually done supply chain management. Right, there you go. Right, I hide my practical side as much as I can, but I believe we've all worked We all do research working with real organizations to improve their supply chains, to make them both better at the things we typically talk about, cost, quality, delivery, but simultaneously making them more sustainable. You want to build on that, or?
Yeah, and also just how do we move inventory? How do we deal, like considering examples of dual sourcing, of expediting shipments, of how do we optimize our operations? Yeah.
Superb. Thank you so much, Mark and Heleche, for that insight into what the program was going to provide. I took some notes there as I was listening to you, and it's like ranging from sustainability, about resilience and adaptability, value chain, digitization, finance, insurance, regulation, big risks in terms of climate. And I think accountability really hit me at one point as well as a key source. And then, of course, that resilience of building that into your people and your teams as well. So thank you so much. I hope people who signed up for the webinar today really enjoyed and learned and gained from it. Please feel free to contact me. My contact details will be sent out in the details afterwards, and we'd be happy to chat to you about you and your specific situation in the program. And I suppose I'd just like to thank Mark and Heleche once more, and give people back the gift of time, a couple of minutes to go and get a sandwich or a cup of tea before you start back into your afternoon day. So thank you very much for everybody at UCD Executive Development.
Thanks.
Thank you.